The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Yours need not be a city that never sleeps to still have plenty of nighttime economic activity. Could a nightmare, as in an after-hours mare, help? We'll find out how some municipalities are taking just such an approach to assist business in the after 9 to 5 economy. Then, writer Shadi Hamid on his new book that explains why Western efforts at exporting liberal democracy to the Middle East did not succeed and what he says might. It's Tuesday, June 20th, and that's next on The Agenda. Ottawa is our nation's capital, yes, but it's also affectionately referred to as the city that fun forgot. Maybe to try to chip away at that reputation, the city recently decided to appoint a nightlife commissioner. It's part of a wider recognition by cities in Canada and beyond that after the 9 to 5 economy winds down, plenty of businesses are still going strong or even just starting their day. And post-pandemic, they too could use some economic development help. Let's find out more. We're joined in Vancouver, British Columbia by Nate Sabine. He is chair of the board of the Hospitality Vancouver Association and director of business development at Blueprint. That's an entertainment and hospitality company. On Manhattan Island in New York City, Ariel Palitz, former nightlife mayor of New York. And in our nation's capital, Emmanuel Ray, Economic Development Officer for the City of Ottawa. And we're delighted to welcome the three of you onto TVO tonight for a conversation that I suspect a lot of people really know very little about. So, Emmanuel, let's just start with something very basic. When you talk about the nighttime economy, what are you talking about?
Absolutely. So the nighttime economy, we're looking at the hours between 6 p.m. and 6 a.m. So that transition from the daytime economy to the nighttime economy. Specifically for the city of Ottawa, we've looked at the nightlife economy, which is a subsector of the nighttime economy. So that's what the city of Ottawa is focused on, nightlife, and I'll be pleased to expand on that a little bit more as needed.
Do it right now if you wouldn't mind. You're
Sure.
creating a nightmare, M-A-Y-O-R, not a nightmare, which is a different thing, but you're creating this nightlife commissioner. What do you want the commissioner to do?
So the commissioner's that individual's role will really be to connect with residents, connects with businesses that support the nightlife economy, and really be that voice that is in between the elected officials, working with the city, working with city departments, but really doing what they can to support the nightlife economy. So they'll be spurring conversations. They'll be working on a number of initiatives to support the nightlife economy, and we're getting started on that right away. That's the first order of business is to identify and find this nightlife commissioner.
Okay,
City of Ottawa.
We're going to give you lots of free advice here on TVO tonight because we happen to have somebody with us who's actually had the job. Ariel, you were New York City's first ever nightmare, if I can call it that. How did you get the job in the first place?
Well, we like to call it nightlife mayor to help resolve any confusion with that. So yeah, I grew up in New York City. I was born and raised, going out mostly. I owned my own nightclub for 10 years. I served on my local community board on the liquor licensing committee for 7. And actually, while I owned my nightclub, I was the #1 most complained about bar in New York from one chronic caller, which really sort of activated me and politicized me to not only defend myself, but really the ways in which operators were identified and treated as they interact with the city.
So how did you, presumably you put yourself in a position to get this gig from the city. Why did the city want to give you the job to begin with?
Well, I mean, a lot of people wanted the job. It's an important job. A lot of people misunderstand what it might mean. It's not about going out every night, as was previously identified. It's really about being a convener and finding non-enforcement and creative solutions to help resolve the issues that really affect the entire ecosystem of not only nightlife, but life at night. So you're dealing with owners and workers and operators, as well as residents and patrons. And I think most importantly, historically, nightlife has not necessarily been appreciated, an appreciated industry or culture or economy. It has been really truly criminalized, overly restricted, enforced upon. And I think now we see a global nightlife movement where even 5 years ago when I was appointed, it was really just the beginning. The first was in Amsterdam. And now there's almost 80 offices of nightlife around the world that recognize that the nighttime economy and culture are essential to our economic, cultural, and personal well-being. And the COVID-19 pandemic really demonstrated what a life would be like without a nightlife industry. And so these offices really are there to help reframe a historically framed industry, convene and be a liaison for the industry and all its components to the city and elected officials.
Nate, why don't you pick up on that and tell us how you see the mission of the Vancouver Office for Nighttime Economy?
Yeah, it's almost exactly what Ariel said. It's in Vancouver, especially if Ottawa is referred to as a city that fun forgot. Vancouver was called No Fun City for 10, 15 years. And some people still call it that. I've been saying for a long time that if you're calling Vancouver No Fun City still, you're not trying very hard. Because things have gotten a lot better here. But our sort of march toward this office started, I think, in 2017 when the then city council and mayor elected to, put forth a motion to do a late night lockout, which would mean that after a certain point in the night, we wouldn't be allowed any new patrons into the bars and clubs in our entertainment district or anywhere else in the city, which had devastating consequences in King's Cross, especially in Australia, if you want to use that for sort of a test case of what a moronic idea that was. Anyway, so this led us to finding Mirik Milan, who, as Ariel pointed out, was the first night mayor ever in Amsterdam. And we flew him over twice to speak to city council, to speak to the Board of Trade, the Downtown Vancouver Business Improvement Association, the community, and started getting this idea out that this is the way to go. So, it's been a while, and the then mayor, and now we're on the third mayor who has had this in a platform or as a priority. And a lot of it, I think we would already be there were it not for the pandemic. But we are just finishing up a report for city council, which will then hopefully catalyze the rest of getting this office together. But it's everything that Emmanuel and Ariel already spoke about. It is about advocacy. It is about building a bridge. It is about understanding the needs. It is about tourism, filling hotel rooms, and it is about culture. At the end of the day, we believe in culture through commerce, if you will. The ecosystem, nothing happens in a vacuum. Everything happens together. And I think that it's an idea whose time has come.
Okay, let me follow up with Ariel on something, because I can imagine that if the nighttime mayor and the real mayor of the 5 boroughs are not on the same page, that there could be some stickiness. So when you got appointed, who was the actual mayor of New York City?
I was appointed by Mayor de Blasio, and I was able to stay on through the new administration with Eric Adams. Both mayors understood the importance of the economy at night, the culture at night, that New York is the city that never sleeps. But really, no matter what city you're in around the world, life is 24 hours. The idea that it's somehow divided into day and night. And I mean, let people live 24 hours a day. Even if you say, I don't go out at night, you do. You go out to restaurants, you have a drink after work. And so it is obviously extremely important to have a mayor who understands that the city is a 24-hour entity and that it is something that is worthy and deserving of support and resources and respect, and to see the nighttime businesses as essential and to see them as partners in not only developing the economy, but safety and quality of life. Again, historically, this has been an adversarial relationship. Stigmas around nightlife help to prevent that sort of more productive relationship with government. But I think those days are really, thankfully, far behind us, and the industry is being respected and these offices are being created in order to develop those partnerships, resources, and support.
Got it. Emmanuel, I want to get you back in here in as much as we just heard Nate describe how too many people, in his view, still regard Vancouver. And, if they say it about Vancouver as the place where you go for no fun, they say it doubly as much about your city, the capital city of the whole country. It's a one industry town, and if you're not in that industry, which is politics, forget it. So, but let me hear it from you. How would you characterize Ottawa, Ontario, Canada right now?
Well, Ottawa is an amazing city, and if anyone hasn't been here, in the last couple of years, and certainly during the pandemic, we understand tourism slowed down, but we're having a busy here in Ottawa. Nightlife here is amazing. It's something that, and it's certainly been that case for quite some time. The number of events that I attempted to go to recently, they're sold out for nighttime events. So, and these are large, cultural types of events. Where people are getting together, so it's certainly it's an old adage, and it's time to move beyond that verbiage and really celebrate. We're a world-class, multicultural, very diverse city, and the nightlife economy is really an opportunity to celebrate that and to bring people together. The cultural aspects, the arts aspect, the recreational aspect, the entertainment aspect. There's certainly a lot of components that are thriving here in Ottawa, and certainly our role with this nightlife commissioner's office is to really support that part of the economy. It's vital to our city. It's vital for talent attraction. It's critical, obviously, for people living and working here in the city.
Well, Nate, if some cities have a snoozy reputation, it's often because the people who live there like it that way. They're not thrilled with the idea of nightclubs being open maybe close to their neighborhoods until 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning with lots of noise and all of the other stuff that comes along with that. So what would you say to people who think, I don't want my city to be too exciting late at night, and I'm very content, thank you very much, with it being kind of bland?
I would say, I'm going to paraphrase or sort of reuse Fran Leiboviz's recent series, and pretend it's a city. You need to understand that Vancouver, whether you like it or not, is an internationally renowned city, and we have visitors from all over the world all times of year, and it's only growing, as is the populace. So it's been really interesting here because we have areas that have built up around hospitality and nightlife venues that have been there. At Blueprint, we own a building that's been there for 100 and something years, and it's always been a dance hall, a nightclub, you name it, since for the entire time. We have a plaque on the front of the building, and a developer puts up a building behind there, and the residents start complaining. There should be a tacit understanding of what you're moving into and where you're living, and this in the entire history of Vancouver has been nightlife and culture and events capitulating to a few complaints from a few residents. And that's not to say that things are always perfect, but they're definitely weighted heavily on one side, and it's not on ours. Everything from the noise bylaws, we make music now differently with technology, with the current sounds. Music is made differently than it was when these bylaws were put into place and these noise restrictions, and they just don't work. So it's very simple things like that. And to me, it's a matter of thinking about somebody other than yourself. If I can understand not wanting to be kept up till 5 a.m, but if that's happening, then you probably moved into an entertainment district and maybe you should live somewhere else. The other is thinking about the health of the city and the community. We sacrifice things every day, things that you don't even think about. I think sacrificing for a little bit of culture, a little bit of tourism for the health of the city is a reasonable ask.
Okay, Ariel, I would like you, well, let me put it this way. Everybody understands that nightlife includes things like in New York City, it's Broadway, it's restaurants, it's theater, it's all of that stuff you traditionally think of. But of course, it's also bartenders and waitresses and cleaners and a lot of people who do kind of tough jobs overnight so that the city looks great the next day when people are going into their offices. So how does your office serve those folks?
Well, the Office, again, of Nightlife really is meant to serve the entire ecosystem of life at night in order to ensure that it is healthy and operating and supported. That includes workers as well, of course. And the way the Office of Nightlife is able to support them is, first of all, to amplify their needs and to make sure that they are aware of their resources and their rights, to understand their labor laws. We also created the Elevate Nightlife Mental Health and Physical Well-Being program, which working at night is extremely stressful. It's got a lot of challenges, and so it was important for our office, while I was the director, to put an emphasis on making sure that they were aware of what their resources were, that were free, sliding scale, not only for mental health, physical health, as well as spiritual well-being. But I think just to also be able to touch upon the patrons and their role in this, we know that most enforcement against nightlife venues is complaint driven, and it tends to be that one person, a chronic caller. But now, unlike before, we have anonymous automated complaint systems that don't properly communicate to the venue operators what the issues are. They tend to side on the resident side, but at the end of the day, if there's not communication, there's not going to be resolution and improvement of quality of life. Enforcement and having a police officer showing up at 3 o'clock in the morning and telling your bar back to turn it down is not sufficient in order to improve not only the conditions, but the relationship. And so the Office of Nightlife in New York created MEND NYC. It stands for Mediating Establishment Neighborhood Disputes, a non-enforcement solution that not only helps the resident, but the venue, but elected officials who receive complaints, the police department who has minimal resources to actually be able to use it towards actual crime. You shouldn't be using police officers to tell a venue to turn it down. And so this mediation program helps them to know, is it in the front or is it in the back? Is it the volume? Is it the bass? Is it voices? And it creates a mutually respectful condition to speak during the day and to find resolutions and to get it out of the complaint system and to minimize enforcement and improve quality of life. And so finding non-enforcement creative solutions that are mutually beneficial for every party involved is really the way to go, and the role of the Office of Nightlife. And well, that includes for employees.
Sure. That takes me to Emmanuel next because, well, Emmanuel, I don't have to tell you, somebody from our neck of the woods just bought your favorite hockey team. And from what I understand, he wants to, or he is hopeful, and I heard Mayor Sutcliffe say this the other day, they're hopeful about a new arena in downtown Ottawa. Not necessarily LeBreton Flats, but further downtown. Now, I can only imagine, let's fast forward several years when perhaps this is all done, I can only imagine people who've lived in that part of Ottawa for years and years and did not expect to see 18,000 people coming into their neighborhoods every third or fourth night, suddenly not being thrilled with the notion. So, as you look forward, how do you plan to balance the needs of local residents with the needs of the Ottawa Senators, with the needs of all of the people who are going to be making a living off the Senators coming further into the city, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think certainly this is happening across the country and across the globe. Is the downtowns are changing. There's a shift, obviously, from workers working from home more often, and the downtown is in need of revitalization. Ottawa's nightlife economy action plan is focused on citywide changes to support the nightlife economy, but certainly downtown. There's an opportunity, and we're certainly very excited that the senators are going to be moving downtown, and with a new ownership group, and part of their commitment is to build downtown. And as you mentioned, Mayor Sutcliffe is very supportive of that. He's also very supportive of nightlife, of growing our economy, and turning improving things in Ottawa when it comes to downtown. So I only see it as a positive. I think this will be a great opportunity. Residents moving downtown, and we need more residents moving downtown. You look at some of the vibrancy that happens in and around, for example, the Sky Dome, or the Rogers Centre in Toronto, and all the nightlife that happens around that area. Certainly, it'd be a welcome change for Ottawa to have that immediate access to something downtown. So, and part of that plan is to support the Canada community with that transition as well, because there's obviously a great asset, in Canada, where the senators currently play, and part of the plan has to be able to look at that side as well.
Sure. Nate, tell me this. What happens when the nighttime commissioner or the nighttime mayor has an idea that would be helpful to the nighttime economy of, for example, Vancouver, but the actual elected mayor of Vancouver doesn't think it's a good idea? How do they resolve that issue?
That's a great question. I wish I could get back to you in a year or so after this thing is up and running. But I think it would probably be, and we're especially lucky because our current mayor his motto, or one of his mottos, is that Vancouver is open for business. So I think that if it's safe, and if it makes fiscal sense, and if it's good for culture, it will win with this mayor and council at least. And to be perfectly frank, the staff at City Hall, everybody seems to be singing from the same songbook for the first time since I've been around, which is quite a while. So I think the mayor, to answer your question in brief, I think the mayor is going to win, and he's going to, because he's the actual mayor. But I think that it's going to be in Vancouver for hopefully a long time. It's going to be the best idea wins, gets pushed forward, and we go from there.
Ariel, how long did you have the job for, and why did you eventually leave it?
Well, our office was created legislatively and is written into law, regardless of who the mayor is, thankfully. And I think any mayor will understand that their cities are 24 hours, and that proactive rather than reactive management is key in order to be able to improve the conditions everyone's been complaining about for decades. I just want to say that. I had the job for 5 years as the first to help build the infrastructure and foundation and identify the priorities, and navigated it through the pandemic and 2 mayors. And I think it's really important to know that the first person, yes, is important to help define those things, but you don't want to have founder syndrome. This is not supposed to be based on my personality or my connections and my abilities. The fact that it's codified into law demonstrates it's essential to the city, and it's essential for it to go on for generations to come and many mayors to come. And I felt a responsibility to make sure that I helped to deliver that to the next director, which New York is still in the process of, and then also to be able to continue my personal work to help other cities around the world to establish their offices, as well as to continue to advocate and advise the industry locally.
I hope you won't find this too chippy a question, but given the 5 years that you had the job, international pandemic, 2 different mayors, New Yorkers' famous passivity and gentleness and always getting along with each other as part, no doubt, of all of the people you've done. How did you keep your sanity, Ariel, is what I guess I'm trying to ask.
Well, I mean, it was an extraordinary opportunity, a gift to be able to love an industry so much, to be able to know how it's been mistreated and how to support it and to be given the opportunity to fix it. I mean, what better opportunity? It really gave me life rather than took it away, to be honest. To really be able to support businesses, improve quality of life, deal with harm reduction and equity and accessibility, and to do it on a citywide level that's impacting also and influencing the world. It was, you know, the best job in the world. And I think it's important that the movement continues, and I'll do everything in my power to help support it from this moment on.
Lovely. In our last minute here, Emmanuel, let me give it to you. And that is, you know, you can imagine how difficult a job it is for the New York nightlife mayor to be seen to be fair when you've got such wide varieties in New York as Manhattan Island and Staten Island. Those are two pretty different places. And you're going to have the same problem, right? I mean, downtown Ottawa is pretty different from Canada. You've already talked about that. How do you do the job fairly going forward?
Well, as I mentioned, you know, the City of Ottawa's Nightlife Economy Action Plan is really focused on as a citywide strategy. So it's not going to single out one specific area. We know that certain parts of the city are more popular for different demographics, and we'll look at supporting those areas as well. But you know, it's both the urban and the outer urban areas. Taking a look at how we can support businesses and look at the broader economy. Nightlife is a subsection of the broader economy. We're working on supporting the broader economy as well, and cultural supports, and supporting small businesses and entrepreneurs, and the nightlife economy is really kind of a combination of those aspects. So certainly nightlife, it's approximately $1.5 billion spend here within the city, and that will only grow as our city grows. And we're looking forward to welcoming newcomers and immigrants, and they add to that vibrancy that's part of Ottawa. So we're looking forward to that.
Okay, Ariel, there are a lot of people who, when they think of nightlife, they think of drugs, they think of prostitution, they think of other undesirable stuff happening on the streets that they don't want any part of. How do you deal with all of that?
It's a fair question. I think a lot of that insinuation is a huge part of the stigma that has been placed upon life at night. We know that drugs, prostitution, shootings, all the sort of unsavory elements of life can happen anywhere, anytime, in any industry. The life at night is equally essential, important, and can be equally as safe with proactive management that understands the condition, organizing city services like police, fire, health department, like you would any large festival or event that happens quite seamlessly in every city. There has been a history of misunderstanding and misdefining this industry. What we learned during the pandemic is that cities can't live without it. People can't live without it. Depression, suicide, relapse of addiction were all due to not having nightlife, not because it was there. And so the purpose of having offices of nightlife is being able to understand the asset and the value, to understand the misunderstandings and stigma that has led to over enforcement and restriction and a lack of city planning that creates unsafe conditions. It's only through partnership with Life at Night and operators that we can create safer and more vibrant cities.
I want to thank Nate Sabine in Vancouver and Emmanuel Ray in Ottawa and Ariel Palitz on Manhattan Island in New York City for joining us on TVO tonight and telling us all about the new Nightmare. Okay, Nighttime Mayor, I guess that's a better title. Coming your way in Ottawa and Vancouver, and thanks for the experience, Ariel. Good to have you all on board.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Since the end of World War II and amplified after the Cold War, Western countries, led by the United States, wanted to make democracy a leading export. It has not gone smoothly, and in some places, it's gone sideways. Shadi Hamid's new book takes a hard look at why. It's called The Problem of Democracy: America, the Middle East, and the Rise and Fall of an Idea. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a contributing writer at The Atlantic. And Shadi Hamid joins us now from Washington, D.C., and it's great to have you on our program, Shadi. How you doing tonight?
Pretty good. Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me.
Not at all. Let's take you back 3+ decades, the fall of the Soviet Union. You write that as Europe and much of the world adopted then to democracy, the Middle East instead moved towards authoritarianism. So let's start there. How come?
Yeah, so we used to support, or the U.S. used to support dictators in Latin America, Asia, Africa throughout the Cold War. And the idea there was it's better to support right-wing dictators than have communist parties or socialist parties rising to power. But with the fall of the Soviet Union and just a decline of the appeal of communism, that started to change in the 1980s. And you start to see the U.S. supporting democratic transitions in those other regions, Brazil, Argentina, South Korea, the Philippines, and so on. And then the 90s come, and then obviously you have the spread of democracy in Eastern Europe, but the Middle East stays as an exception. And one of the reasons is we as Americans have been afraid of what elections might lead to in the Middle East, that democracy can produce outcomes that we find unpalatable. And oftentimes it's religiously oriented parties, also known as Islamist parties, that tend to do quite well in elections across the Middle East. So that's one thing. And the other is that in the 1990s, the priority of the Clinton administration was the Oslo process and pursuing a two-state solution in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the thinking there was you need to have strong authoritarian leaders to push these peace treaties through, because these are generally anti-Israel populations. So if people vote for whoever they want, then you might not get all that much support for peace. So we actually increased our support to various autocrats. And a peace treaty was signed in Jordan, for example, in 1994. And that became really the key focus of the Clinton administration, where there was a sense that democracy can come later. We have national interests and priorities that take precedence. And that's been part of the story ever since.
So we particularly love democracy, especially when Thomas Jefferson's on the ballot. Only trouble is he hasn't been.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. There's a new report from a group called Varieties of Democracy Institute. It's an independent think tank out of the University of Gothenburg. It says only 2% of people in the Middle East and North Africa live under liberal democracies. It's the second worst performing region in the world. You know, you could get very, very depressed if you believe in democracy and you believe in its export. You could get very depressed about the state of affairs in that part of the world. Do you?
It's a great question. I actually do sometimes. And I mean, 2% is actually a little bit more than I expected. I would have thought it would be closer to 0. So I guess there's a silver lining there. But, you know, in all seriousness, I think that the experience of the Arab Spring was difficult, I think, for a lot of us who work on the Middle East. I was in Tahrir Square the day that Mubarak fell, the dictator of Egypt, on February 11th, 2011. Sure, a lot of viewers remember those images and just how inspiring it was. And then just to see how that all sort of fell apart just in the span of a couple of years, it is sad. And Tunisia was the lone bright spot of the Arab Spring. And even there now, there has been a slow motion coup and a dictatorship is emerging. So it is difficult to look at that and to be positive. I mean, my view is we do the best we can and we try to support the ideas. And as an American who tries to influence policymakers in Washington, D.C., I try to make the best case possible that this is a real mistake. This kind of falling back on supporting dictators after the optimism of the Arab Spring. I really do think that the U.S. has to fundamentally reorient its policy, and that might not happen right away. But my hope is that, with a younger generation of policymakers and analysts, that something different might be possible in the future. But we'll have to wait. It's not looking good for the foreseeable future.
Well, let's stay back then. Let's stay there with the Arab Spring. And you'll forgive the way I put it here, but when the Arab Spring sprung, the Barack Obama administration was in power. Based on your recollection of the time, do you think they saw it, the administration officials of that era, do you think they saw it more as a crisis to be managed or an opportunity to export democracy?
Yeah, so in my book, I interview a number of senior Obama officials who were with Obama in the room at key moments. And there definitely are figures in the story who saw it as a crisis. They saw it as something to manage. They saw it as a nuisance. Because for them, especially if you've been doing policy for several decades, you get used to the fact that there are these dictators that you work with in countries like Egypt, Jordan, Morocco, Saudi Arabia, and so forth. And to see all of that change very quickly, it does unsettle you. And there were younger aides to Obama, such as Ben Rhodes, for example, who were more enthusiastic about the Arab Spring, but there was always this tension between different agencies in the U.S. and different senior officials. And Obama himself actually soured on the Arab Spring pretty quickly. He saw that there was a lot of chaos in the region. There was civil war emerging in Libya and Syria. And also, I think this is a very important part, that in countries like Egypt, you had groups like the Muslim Brotherhood absolutely dominating elections. And liberals and secular parties were doing pretty terribly. So I think that we as Americans, that was hard for us because we think if democracy is good, it will lead to good outcomes. People we like English-speaking young liberal revolutionaries, they're the ones who are going to do well. But what we saw was that is not necessarily the case. When you give people the right to vote in free elections, sometimes they'll choose options that we as Americans don't like. And I think that was a hard thing for people to really fully absorb.
Well, there's that famous line, of course, that elections in the Middle East can often be one person, one vote, one time, and fill in the blanks after that. I think President Obama also once said, "All I need in the Middle East is a few smart autocrats." Now, that's not something you'd expect to hear out of the mouth of a democratically elected president of the United States. I guess you think that reveals hypocrisy at its worst? I don't know. You tell me.
Yes. So that quote, it is really hard to believe. And for people who haven't heard that quote before, it's like, wait, could Obama really have said that? He did. I think it does capture part of his thinking. He just got fed up with the Middle East. And, throughout the interviews that I conducted for the book, that theme kept on coming up, that Obama wanted to pivot to Asia. He wanted to focus on domestic priorities. He didn't want to get more involved in the Middle East. Part of the rise of Obama had to do with disengaging from the Middle East. He wanted to contrast himself with George W. Bush, his predecessor. So I think that you start to see this frustration building on Obama's part. And it's almost like, why can't these Arabs get their stuff together? Like, why is it? And I think there was an unwillingness to look inward and be self-critical and to acknowledge that a big part of the problem was America's own history of involvement in the Middle East. When you've supported authoritarian regimes for decades, from the 1950s onwards, to the tune of tens of billions of dollars of aid and weapon sales and so on, then obviously it's going to be very difficult to change that. And it requires patience. It requires a strategy. And U.S. officials, by and large, didn't have that patience.
Just parenthetically, what do you think Ben Rhodes thinks of the fact that Donald Trump's administration managed to get the Abraham Accords, so some progress on Middle East peace, whereas the Obama administration really didn't?
It's a good point, and this gets to a tension between pursuing Arab-Israeli peace and democracy, because with the Abraham Accords, the countries that signed on to that, for example, the UAE and Bahrain, are two of the most repressive countries in the region. And there was no real popular buy-in. You just have a few very powerful autocrats who kind of make that decision. You don't have to ratify a peace treaty in parliament. You don't have to worry about the polling on how people feel about Israel. So this brings us back to the link that I mentioned in the 1990s, where if you really do prioritize Arab-Israeli peace above all else, you're going to end up prioritizing autocrats. And it's, worth remembering that Trump was very enthusiastic about Arab autocrats. He even joked once about the Egyptian dictator saying he's my favorite dictator. And it was that sort of thing that we saw under Trump. There wasn't even a pretense of caring about democracy. And you might say, at least with Obama, there was the pretense. At least there was some willingness to push, at least in the early period of the Arab Spring. Trump just did away with all of that. And it's an interesting kind of question. Maybe some people would prefer the honesty of Donald Trump, that it's better not to pretend if you're not going to actually take democracy promotion seriously.
Right. Well, you've advanced an idea called democratic minimalism. Why don't you take a moment and tell us what you mean by that?
Yeah, so we as Americans, when we use the word democracy, we pack a lot into it. And usually what we mean is liberal democracy. And by liberalism here, I'm talking about the kind of non-negotiable rights and freedoms that we associate with the American Constitution, the Bill of Rights. So you have an emphasis on the individual over the collective, on reason over revelation, on moving towards minority rights and gender equality. And these are things that we can say are good, they're important, but they're not necessarily always intertwined with democracy. And if we think about democracy in the more minimalistic sense, we're really talking about periodic elections that allow for rotation of power between competing parties and politicians. It's not so much about making people more liberal or having these cultural changes. And I think part of what I try to do in the book is decouple these concepts. And it's not just in the Middle East that we see these tensions. In the US, in Western Europe, we have right-wing populist parties who have come to power through democratic elections. And this shows, again, that democracy doesn't necessarily lead to liberal progress. It can lead to anti-immigrant sentiment, Islamophobia, regression on gender equality. We have a debate around abortion rights in this country. So I think that we have to just be careful about how we use these terms, and especially in the Middle East, which is a religiously conservative region, people are going to want to express that religious conservatism in elections. They're going to probably vote for parties that are less secular and less liberal. We don't have to like that as Americans or Westerners, but I think we have to come to terms with that. And we have to say, look, it is up to Egyptians, Jordanians, Tunisians to make their own decisions about the values that they prioritize. And if they don't value the same things that we as Americans do, that's really their choice in the end. And I think this is a more realistic way of approaching democracy, because we can't always get everything that we want from elections. Life is about trade-offs, and so is politics.
Well, let me ask about those trade-offs. And, I'll admit here this is a bit of an extreme example. But again, following up on where you just left off, is that to say that Americans should be content if, for example, people in Afghanistan actually elect in free and fair elections a Taliban government which pulls women out of schools, inflicts capital punishment for things like blasphemy, isn't remotely close to what we would consider to be, quote unquote, normal Western democratic values. Should we be content with that?
So groups like the Taliban don't even buy into my minimalistic conception of democracy. They don't believe in democratic elections. They took power through brute force. And they've never suggested that they're willing to accept alternation of power, even the existence of other political parties that can challenge them. So for democracy to be meaningful, you do have to have parties. You do have to have alternatives. People do need the right to criticize the government. So in that sense, groups like the Taliban don't even pretend to be interested in that. And so there still has to be some freedom. There still has to be some ability to protest and to make choices. And groups like the Taliban are so extreme that they can't even meet that minimal hurdle. So I'm not saying that anything goes. There still do have to be basic minimal standards that parties and politicians meet, because you don't want a situation where all the other parties are banned. You don't want a situation where people can't even gather in the main square. But I make a distinction between those things which are about the means of politics versus the ends of politics, which are more about cultural and religious values. And there, as long as it's within the Constitution or the legal framework, I do think that we have to be somewhat accepting that some right-wing parties are going to push the boundaries and move in a more culturally or religiously conservative direction. That doesn't mean they can ban women from voting, because then it wouldn't be a democracy. Democracy requires universal suffrage. So there's obviously going to be limits still.
Gotcha. Let me stick with Afghanistan for one more question here. And to do that, I want to quote from a book by Rory Stewart, the former Conservative cabinet minister from the UK, who in 2002 actually walked the entirety of Afghanistan on foot to learn about its people. And here's what he writes. He said, "I now had half a dozen friends working in Afghanistan in embassies, think tanks, international development agencies, the UN, and the Afghan government, controlling projects worth millions of dollars. Their objective was, quote, the creation of a centralized, broad-based, multi-ethnic government committed to democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. Democratization, enhancing capacity, gender, sustainable development. They were mostly in their late 20s or early 30s. They rarely drove their SUVs outside Kabul because their security advisors forbade it. They came from postmodern, secular, globalized states with liberal traditions in law and government. But what did they understand of the thought processes of Sayed Kerbalahi's wife, who had not moved 5 kilometers from her home in 40 years? Or Dr. Habibullah, the vet who carried an automatic weapon in the way they carried briefcases? Okay, to what extent do you think we in the West tried and failed to re-engineer Afghan political culture to match our own?
Yeah, that's really a great quote from Rory Stewart that I think captures this dilemma quite well, that we as outsiders come into these societies and we think there's a linear path to progress, that all peoples and cultures will follow the same way that we did as Westerners. We don't take into account the local context, and we don't look outside of major cities. I mean, part of the problem, a lot of these aid workers and Afghan elites in Kabul, you go outside the city and you see a very different kind of culture. And so when you have these Western educated technocrats, including the last Afghan president, Ashraf Ghani, for example, who everyone in the West was like, he's perfect. He's exactly what we're looking for. But he was out of touch with his own society. And if we can't really understand that and grasp that, we run into problems. And gender was mentioned. The U.S. spent something close to $1 billion on gender-related programs. That's not a bad thing, But to make that the focus, or to make that a major plank of the entire U.S. strategy, without keeping in mind that that might create a backlash, that maybe you want to go a little bit slower and focus on other things first, setting up a workable political system. And another part of the problem was that the U.S. also created a very strong presidency. And this is generally not good for divided societies, because it makes politics into winner takes all. If there's one dominant president and parliament isn't as important, then that's going to be quite polarizing, because there can only be one president. So there were a lot of mistakes in the early years of the Afghan nation building process. And look, it's difficult. And that's why I think that when we talk about democracy promotion, we shouldn't think about nation building. We shouldn't think about Iraq and Afghanistan as models that we ever want to repeat. And most of what I call for in the book is actually prioritizing countries that we already have close relationships with, autocratic allies like Egypt that aren't in a state of civil war or civil conflict, and to use our aid to put pressure on them to at least move in a less autocratic direction. I think that's more modest. It's still challenging. It's still ambitious. But that's the kind of democracy promotion that I'm calling for, not the kind that goes into a country and sets up shop for 20 years and tries to re-engineer an entire political culture.
No, I take your point, but putting ourselves in their shoes for a second, is there any particular reason why Middle Eastern countries should depend on the West to help them establish democratic norms in their countries, when they no doubt look at us and think, there's nothing over there that looks of particular interest to us, I have to say?
Yeah, well, first of all, as much problems as America has and other Western countries, we still have to remember America is a democracy, a very successful one, and we still do enjoy amazing freedoms that are extremely rare in the Middle East. So I think that if you're coming from that context where you have to worry about the secret police coming at your door at dawn and taking you away on like false charges, I do think there is a lot about the American example that can still inspire for all of our faults. But the reason that the U.S. needs to play a role in the Middle East to encourage democracy is because we are already supporting these autocratic regimes. We are still putting billions of dollars into these regimes. So in some sense, if you're a pro-democracy activist in Egypt, you're fighting two fronts. You're fighting your own government, but you're also fighting the patrons of your government, and that includes the U.S. And that's why it's very hard for protests to succeed, because you have these militaries that, you know, they interfere in politics, they prevent democratic progress. So at some basic level, the U.S. has to withdraw support from these autocratic structures. Otherwise, it's going to be very, very challenging. And that's precisely what happened in Latin America in the 1980s. The U.S. used to support those autocrats. Then it slowly and gradually withdrew support. And that created openings for pro-democracy activists and protesters to really push for change.
Well, all right, let's finish up on this, because, and I guess this will require me to just gently push back a little bit on what you just said, because one does look at the last 20 years of Middle East history, and one sees the Americans making endless sacrifices, both in terms of people and you know, blood and treasure, as the expression goes. The United States today talks a whole lot less about terrorism than it used to 15 or 20 years ago. It is energy self-sufficient today, so those relationships with, for example, Saudi Arabia are less than what they were. It seems very focused on China going forward. One does wonder if the United States has, in effect, given up on trying to bring democracy to the Middle East and Northern Africa. What say you?
Yeah, it does sometimes seem like that. I think it's a mistake, because President Biden has talked about the central struggle of our time being between democracies and autocracies. And if we're going to make that argument, which I think is a good argument, then it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to make the entire Middle East an exception. It undermines our credibility. It makes us look like we're unserious. If we really believe this is the central struggle of our time and that it matters how countries organize their political systems, then we should act like it and we should be more consistent about it. And this also gets to, I think, a point that is becoming more clear with every year. Saudi Arabia, countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt are deepening their economic and security cooperation with countries like China, with Russia too. They haven't been on the right side of the Ukraine war. So if we're putting these billions of dollars to these leaders and they won't even align with the US on something as basic as Russia, these are not reliable allies, and it's unsustainable. And I think what I would have hoped the Arab Spring would teach us is that regimes can seem stable, authoritarian regimes, that is, can seem stable until they're not, and then it's too late. And I feel like we're repeating that same mistake over and over. 2 weeks before Mubarak fell in Egypt, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said, "Our assessment is that the Egyptian regime is stable." 2 weeks later, the regime fell. That tells you something, that you don't want to put too much of your eggs in the authoritarian basket.
Indeed. Very thought-provoking stuff, Shadi. We're so grateful you spared some time for us on TVO tonight. Your book is called The Problem of Democracy, America, the Middle East, and the Rise and Fall of an Idea. Shadi Hamid, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Steve.
And that is the agenda for Tuesday, June 20th, 2023. Tomorrow is National Indigenous Peoples Day, and we'll find out about the growing popularity of Indigenous-led tourism. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.